So hello, everybody. I am Dr. Terri Daniel, and this is me being a presenter instead of being the facilitator and organizer of this thing. So I'm switching hats after wolfing down my lunch. So forgive me if I'm choking a little bit. And I am, as most of you probably know, I am a chaplain and a grief counselor and an educator. I teach in Kamal's program at the GTU. So I train interreligious chaplains. And my work is focused very much on how toxic theology and religious trauma impacts the way we cope with grief and loss, which is pretty much the theme of this whole symposium today. And my particular talk today is going to be about being spiritual, but not religious, which is a term that has come into popularity probably in the last 15 years or so, more so in the last maybe 5 years. And it's spiritual, but not religious, abbreviated as an acronym SBNR. And we also have something that spun out of that is the nones and dones. So none is N-O-N-E, meaning no religious affiliation. And the done, D-O-N-E, means that you were once affiliated with a religion and now you're not anymore. So we've got the SBNRs and nuns and duns, or nuns, duns, and SBNRs. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to start with just a little bit of history, and I'm only talking about America because that's really the only culture I've ever lived in and the only one I know. So I'm going to start with way back when most of us were children. Some of us might have not even been born then. In 1955, there was a groundbreaking, massive study done on religiosity in America. And the title of the study was called Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. And they interviewed, I don't think I have the number, a lot of people for this study. Like I'm going to just pull the number off the top of my head, like 20,000 people. It was tremendous. And this was 1955. And what they found in their findings were that 95% of the people they interviewed across America identified as either Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish. That was it. That was really the only choices you had in 1955. And it was pretty much, required or expected that you would belong to one of those groups in order to be a functional American citizen. In 1955, you didn't see Muslims and Buddhists and pagans and Hindus walking around. I mean, they were certainly around, but they sort of kept to their own communities. And it was a very white Christian time in America. In fact, one of the researchers that I work with a lot, Harvey Cox, who's done incredible work on the future of religion, says that the period between 1930 and 1960 was called a period of civic religion. So think about that, civic religion, no separation of church and state. If your religion is also part of your civic duty or your civic identity. And so that's how it was back in those days. And it changed in the 1960s because everything changed in the 1960s. Part of the reason it changed, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons I like to think is because Buddhism and Hinduism came to the West. And that happened because in 1950, China invaded Tibet, drove all the monks out of the monasteries. They fled and went into exile. They went to India, and they gradually moved across the globe to Europe and eventually to America. And so those teachings came with them and seeped in little by little, starting around 1950, until they really reached popularity in the 60s and 70s, which is probably when many of us got familiar with Buddhism. And so those teachings came in and gave us options like reincarnation, like perhaps you can have a spiritual practice and a spiritual life without an image of God as a male father figure in the sky who looks down on us and has an opinion about what we do and judges us. So all these new ideas came from the East to the West, and it slowly started to change. So by contrast, let's look at today for a minute. The latest research from the Pew Research on the religious landscape in America, which was just in December 21, so very recent, showed that only 63% of the US population identifies as Christian, which is 12 points lower than it was 10 years earlier. That's compared to almost 95% in 1955. The Pew study also showed that people pray less frequently and fewer people consider religion very important in their lives. Similarly, also in 2021, Gallup poll reported that membership in church, synagogue, or mosque dropped 20 points in the last 20 years. So that's 1 percentage point a year, which is a lot. And that's due primarily to an increase in the number of Americans who have no religious preference, which is the nones. So some other statistics, I'm just going to kind of start out by throwing statistics at you, which is why I'm reading it off a piece of paper. So another researcher that I really love, Putnam and Campbell, bring up some really interesting things. The majority of us, all of us, cited in these statistics were raised with some sort of religion in our home and in our families. And even though we might have had, they say half of us had a religious education of some kind, now roughly half of us have completely departed from the religion of our parents, either by switching to another religion or through lapsing into what they call religious indifference, which means that most of us now choose our religious preferences rather than inheriting them. So you want to think about this language, inherited versus chosen theology. And another way to express that, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, is something called embedded versus deliberative theology. It means exactly the same thing. Inherited is embedded, chosen is deliberative. And deliberative means that you deliberate, you've thought about it, you've taken it apart and unpacked it and analyzed it and deliberated with yourself and perhaps with others about a particular theology. And you deliberately came up with a theology that made more sense to you. So I think all of us here today are interested in this topic because we have deliberated, or we are in the process of deliberating, or we're thinking about deliberating, or we're working with people who are thinking about deliberating. And this is what we're looking at. One of the other researchers, Mercadante, says that SBNR thinking relocates authority from external to internal. And that one of the other researchers says Christianity is still alive and well, but people are looking for more of an experiential theology than a theology that is just handed to them. And I remember in my early life, I've been interested in this subject since I was a kid, and my family wasn't religious at all. But when I was 23, my brother was 10 years younger than me. My family was Jewish, but they weren't religious. They were secular, casual, socially Jewish. My brother had a bar mitzvah, and the rabbi wanted to meet everybody in the family. And I was 23 at the time. I was a hippie living on a commune. I was like way outside the mainstream. So I came in to meet the rabbi. And my question to him was, why did you become a rabbi? Did you have a spiritual experience, some sort of mystical vision that wanted you, that prompted you to be with God? And he said, no, I just really like the religious history. My father was a rabbi. My grandfather was a rabbi. And so his answer to me was, I didn't have an experiential experience of the divine. I just chose it as a path because I identify with that particular thinking and that group and that theology. And so what we're finding in the research now is that identification is no longer enough. There's another phrase that's often used to discuss this, which is called believe, belong, and behave. And there's all this deliberation in theology, like in what order do we do these things if we're going to belong to a spiritual or religious community? Do we first believe? First, we believe in the theology and the doctrine, and therefore that allows us to belong to the group. And then once we belong to the group, we behave according to the behavioral, the moral codes that are expected of us. Or does it go the other way? Do we first behave according to the moral codes, and then that causes us to believe, and then we belong? Or do we start out by just belonging? We're born into a Catholic family, so we belong by birth, like Brian described his birth into his family's religion. And so we start with belonging, and then according to that, as you grow up, you're taught how to behave. So it's belong, then you behave, and then hopefully somewhere along the way you believe. So those three things are really interesting. It's like a shell game, where you mix the things around. There is no right answer, but those are the things that kind of draw us in to a religious tradition of our choosing. So, sorry, I ate something for lunch and it's just making me cough. So I'm sorry about that. So the SBNR movement is all around us. It's really big. It's happening everywhere. And as you might imagine, a lot of people in the religious community are not happy about this. The views of SBNR nuns, duns are sort of split according to party lines. So traditional religious folks think it's a really bad idea to cherry pick. As Kamal was talking about in Islam, you're not supposed to cherry pick, and Christian traditions don't like it if you cherry pick. You take this doctrine and that's it. You don't get to mix and match. And there is one well-known, very conservative Christian theologian named Lillian Daniel who says that the SBNR theology is a cheap god of self-satisfaction. So that's one side of the aisle. And the other side of the aisle says people are drawn more to experiential than to doctrinal elements of religion. So these are two vastly opposing views. So what you're going to find in your work as chaplains and social workers and people working with death and dying is that your clients are going to be just spread out all across this spectrum everywhere. And we'll talk in a little while about how to see where they are in that spectrum, because we're going to talk about Fowler's stages of faith development, which is really fun and interesting. So, you know what, I think I'm going to just go straight to Fowler and then we'll come back to more of this theory. So how many of you, just like wave your hands, not that I can see all of you, have heard of James Fowler and his stages of faith development? Good. All you MDiv people probably, huh? You would have studied that. So Fowler was a theologian and a psychologist who did some groundbreaking research, and I'm a big fan. I did my master's thesis on him, and he based it on some very traditional psychology models. Many of you have studied this, the stages of cognitive development, like, Erikson and Piaget, where it says a child at 2 years old is able to think a certain way. And then at 5, their cognition changes. And then at 7, they can make sense of this and that, and so on and so on and so on through the lifespan. That's been foundational in psychology for many, many decades. So Fowler comes along in, I believe, the early 80s, and he took that stage idea of cognitive development, of how a child develops into an adult, and he applied it to how we think about God and spirituality and the divine. And he used the same kind of idea. And he came up with these 6 stages of faith. I don't actually like to call them stages. I like to call them styles of engaging with the divine, because stages imply that you first go through one and then another and then another. This is why we don't use Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of death and dying anymore, because it isn't like that. And it was never intended to be used for grief, which is a topic of a whole other seminar we could have about why we don't use the stage theory of grief at all. So I'm going to just go over these with you quickly, and I'll send, I don't have a PowerPoint. I don't do slides. I'd rather just talk to you and have you engage with me instead of with my slides. So I will send you this when we're finished, this handout about the stages. So he starts out with stage 0, which is primal faith, which is the primal level of an infant being completely dependent on its parents to keep it alive, to provide everything. For an infant who, of course, isn't cognitively aware of this, the parents are God. And Freud talked about this a lot too in his work. He did a lot of research on this, and he wrote about this and said the image of God that we have, at least in the West, is this father, male parental figure who protects or punishes us. And that this is based, according to Freud and Freudian psychologists, on the relationship that we had with our actual father when we were infants and children. If we had a supportive, loving father, then our image of God is going to reflect that. And if we had an abusive father, our image of God is going to reflect that. I don't personally agree with that, because that would only apply to people who are in the Judeo-Christian culture, and we've already been given that image of God. I don't think we had much of a chance to make that up ourselves, but that's what Fowler's talking about in stage 1, is the idea of the whole big universe to an infant is only this big based on the people who are taking care of you. So that's where we start. Then the next stage is we're now 2 to 6 years old, and he calls it the intuitive reflexive faith. And if you've ever been around a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, you know that they live in a world where fantasy and reality are difficult to differentiate, right? They believe that puppies can talk and elephants can fly and magic just happens everywhere and pumpkins can turn into carriages and all this beautiful childhood stuff. So when a child is given a religious education at this age, all of those stories, Noah's Ark and Jonah got swallowed by a whale, and all those stories are just the same as all the other stories that they're seeing in nursery rhymes and cartoons. And it all just kind of goes into one big bucket in the mind of a 3-year-old. And there's no discernment or differentiation. And there's one story that I love to tell about this. A 4-year-old is walking down the beach with her father, and they come across a dead seagull in the sand. And the kid looks at the bird and says, "Daddy, what happened to the bird?" And Daddy says, "Well, it died and went to heaven." So the kid looks up at the sky where heaven is, down at the bird, and says to her dad, "Did God throw it back down?" Because that's how literal you think when you're 4 years old. So that's a stage that we go through. And again, it's not a stage. I'm going to interrupt to answer Taylor's question. Yeah, okay, somebody did it. Spiritual, but not religious. Thank you. Okay, so there's another example that Fowler gives of this, a 6-year-old who described heaven as a place high in the sky where God lives with the 3 wise men, baby Jesus, and some of the saints. So this is a Catholic child, and this is what they have. You know, they have the Christmas story all mixed up with the saints and everything else. And it's adorable, you know, when it comes out of the mouth of a 4-year-old, until it becomes not adorable anymore. So the next stage is mythic literal faith. And this is when the child is now beginning to see, this is where they learn that Santa Claus isn't real, right? We all went through this. We survived the trauma of finding out that Santa Claus wasn't real. And it helped us to develop our discernment skills. And a wonderful scholar I was talking to the other day made a great comparison. He said, why is it so easy for us to let go of the idea of Santa Claus and not let go of the idea of the punisher, protector, Father God in the sky? And the idea is because letting go of Santa Claus doesn't really have very high stakes. It just means nothing. You're still going to get presents, even if you don't believe in Santa Claus, because your parents are going to give them to you. But if you stop believing God, the stakes are very high. You're going to go to hell. You're going to be rejected by your community. All these other things are going to happen. I thought it was an interesting comparison. So this mythic literal faith is children can begin to understand that some things are figurative or symbolic. And this is usually elementary school and can go all the way up to adolescence. So that's stage 2. Stage 3, he calls synthetic conventional faith. You don't need to write down the names of these. I'm going to email this all to you. So now we're 12 or 13. We've got a little bit of hormones and puberty going on. We're developing social lives outside of our families. And this is where, if you can remember yourself at 13 years old, you're starting to develop independence. You're thinking for yourself. You're questioning things that you've been taught. You're building relationships with the world outside of your family. And at that age, as you all know, friendships and social belonging are probably the most important thing to a 14-year-old kid. And if you're a 14-year-old kid who's raised in a high demand religious environment, such as an enclosed community, Jehovah's Witnesses, Amish, or any group that is very fundamentalist and very closed, you're not going to develop any social connections outside of that group, because that's one of the characteristics of cult-like communities, is that you're not allowed to interact with people outside or read outside materials or do anything outside of the group. So that can really thwart somebody's development if they grow up in that sort of environment. But assuming that they're growing up relatively normally, God now becomes a sort of a friend, because friendship is everything. God is your companion that you can talk to. When you hate your parents and, you're breaking up with your first boyfriend at 14, you talk to God, because God's going to listen, because God is a friend at that stage. That's also the age where churches start really building youth groups. If any of you have ever been in a youth group at a church, that becomes your social life. That becomes your friendship circle. And it's very much taught to you that that is where God is going to be your friend. So that's now 13, 14, 15, 16, up in there. Stage 4 is, I'm going to say probably where most of us here are today, is where you're now, and again, this has nothing to do with age, but it's very roughly broken down that way. So now you've lived some life. You've gotten married and divorced. You've traveled, perhaps you've been to college and you have an education. You're not this little 15-year-old kid anymore. And you have some wisdom, and you hopefully, if you weren't raised in a cult, developed critical thinking skills and the ability to research and reach out and question and discuss and deliberate about your theology. And so now what happens is you're shifting into a place where you can question established beliefs and rebuild them into something that fits. What often happens at this stage too is that you've experienced loss. You've grown up. Maybe your parents have died by the time you're 30, or maybe you had a child that died, or maybe you've been injured and you're disabled for the rest of your life, or divorced, or everything, financial ruin, all the things that happen to us in our adult lives. Many of them have happened to this point. And that is going to prompt you to also start questioning your faith. So that's what happens in stage 4. And stage 5 and 6, I would say that stage 5 is where a lot of us probably are now too. If we make it through these stages, the spiritual crisis is now over and we've landed somewhere. We've had a nice soft landing into a theological framework that supports us in a nice way. So it gives us comfort in a healthy way, not spiritual bypassing, but if we are processing loss and grief, we're doing it with positive religious coping more than negative religious coping. We're not blaming Satan for our loss. We're not feeling that God punished us. We're somewhere a little bit more balanced than that. Does that make sense? And so that's kind of stage 5. And stage 6 is way beyond that. Stage 6 probably nobody alive on Earth is at stage 6. Even the Dalai Lama, I don't know. So we're not even going to talk about that. That's like, enlightenment. So here's what Fowler points out to us. Most people in America are somewhere between stage 2 and stage 3. That's what you're going to find in your work with loss and grief and religious coping. Somewhere between, yes, there's a God in the sky, yes, hell is real and you're going to burn forever, to, yes, the Bible is literal. Yes, a fish really swallowed Jonah and Adam and Eve were really in the garden. All of that. Total literalism, that's stage 2. To stage 3, again, you're at the 14-year-old, 15-year-old stage where God is a friend who supports you and companions you. So sorry about that. So that's where most people are. And that's mostly what you're going to find in your interactions with people dealing with grief. So what happens with grief and loss? If we start our religious education when we're 2 or 3 years old in Sunday school, Brian mentioned this, and we're told all these stories, and we're told that if we ask God to protect us, he will. We're told that prayer is effective. We're told that we're rewarded for good behavior and punished for bad behavior. All this bakes into a nice little cake of a 5-year-old into our theology. And most people never question that. You just kind of go through your life, you get married in a church, you never really think about God, but maybe there's a natural disaster or a terrorist attack or a school shooting, and you send thoughts and prayers, because you still haven't really unpacked that whole idea of what is sending prayers going to do. You're still kind of in it, but you're still an adult. And so none of that changes unless you're someone who, like me, started questioning this stuff when I was 12 and started reading books. My family didn't even have a Bible in the house. I went out and found one when I was 16 because I was so curious about what's all the fuss about this Bible. And I read it as much as I could as a kid. Then I started reading. My father was an intellectual. He was educated. He had books on his bookshelf about comparative religion. I would take those books off the shelf and read about Buddhism and Hinduism and Judaism. And I was just 12, 13 years old. I didn't really understand much of it, but my interest was always there. So unless you were someone like that, you never would question this. There was a Hare Krishna temple around the corner from my house when I was 14. I used to go over there for their Sunday services with the Bhaktivedanta, with the Swami. Anyway, most people don't do that when they're 14. So you're just going through your life. You're carrying this basket of theology around, and it's never questioned until trauma happens. All of a sudden now you're 55 and you've got lung cancer. And one of the first things you're going to think is, what the fuck? Sorry, I just had to say that. Why did God do this to me? I'm healthy. I never smoked. I'm a good person. I have good faith. Why did God do this to me? And that's where the crisis of faith starts to begin. And you start to move into stage 4, where you're individuating and you're being reflective about the theology that you inherited or perhaps chosen. You might have become a born-again Christian when you were 18 and you chose that. And now you might be unchoosing it or deconverting from it. So trauma pushes us toward that kind of movement. And by the way, I'm going to answer questions as we go along because I'm used to looking at the chat box while I teach. So I'm going to comment on Rick Cruz's statement that some chaplains are sadly between 2 and 3 themselves. That is very true. A lot of that has to do with what kind of training they've had and what part of the country you're in. I did a training for hospice staff in Pueblo, Colorado several years ago, and the 3 chaplains on the staff were all just local pastors at the local church. They had no CPE. To them, chaplaining was the same as pastoring. And we did a lot of interactive processes and a lot of work in this workshop, and they were proselytizing to patients. They felt like that was their job because they were not trained as pastors. And I would say that they were clearly seated somewhere between stage 2 and stage 3. So what do we do about this? And this is, and for chaplains, and I know that you're not all chaplains, a lot of you are social workers and nurses, but you all end up having these conversations with your clients. If you're at the bedside, no matter what your role is, and mostly it happens for volunteers, because the volunteers are the ones whose job it is to just be there and listen. And then the chaplains, the nurses are usually too busy to have a conversation. Social workers are there to have a conversation. You're going to be dealing with people having this crisis. And, I can give you a bunch of examples. I'm going to just give you one. Some of you have been to my workshops before, have probably heard me use these examples. I had a client once who was a man, not that old, late 60s, early 70s, diagnosed with a life-threatening illness of some kind. And he called for the chaplain to come and see him. And he said, I was a really bad guy all my life. I was a biker. I was a criminal. I was a meth dealer. I sold meth to teenagers. I beat up women. I raped women. I did all the bad things. But then one day I was camping at this campground with my biker group, and there were these Christians at the encampment, and they were having a revival, and they were baptizing people in their tent. And I wandered over there. I was drunk as shit, and I thought it would be funny. And I wandered over into their camp, and I went into their tent, and they took me in, and they baptized me, and I found Jesus. I felt it. I felt that I was saved. And that was 25 years ago. But then I went back to my old life. I went back to dealing drugs and beating up women and committing crimes, even though I still love Jesus. So my question to you, Chaplain Terri, is now that I'm dying, am I going to heaven or hell? What a great dilemma. What a perfect dilemma for this. So I would love to ask, before I tell you how I answered him, those of you who are chaplains, to tell me how you would have answered this question. You can type it in the chat room. Where do you want to go? That's a good one. That's great. Okay, well, I want to go to heaven. And then what would you say, Santu? Well, then good, you're good to go. You can go wherever you want. That's one particular theology. We don't know what this guy's actual theology is. So what I said to him is this, and this is where we get into the weird toxicity of these theologies, like Brian was describing to us. What we do as chaplains is we never give an answer. We do not educate them. We do not counsel them. We create a space where they can reflect back to us what they are processing in their head. So the perfect chaplain answer to that is, well, what does your faith teach you about this? Put it right back in his lap. And I can see those of you who are chaplains nodding your head because we've all learned this. And then sit with that silence because he's waiting for an answer, but you're not going to give it to him. What does your faith teach you about this? And he thinks about it and he says, well, I think that my faith teaches as long as I have Jesus, I'm good because God forgives me and Jesus forgives me. Right? And I'm not going to say, yeah, that's right, or no, that's not right. I'm just going to let him sit with it, as uncomfortable as it may be, until he figures his way out of it. Okay, so do you love Jesus? Do you feel that Jesus is a part of your life? Do you see Jesus as your savior? Oh yeah, absolutely. I've never given up. Jesus has always been with me. Okay, and your faith tells you that as long as you have Jesus, you'll go to heaven. Yeah, right. Well, you're good to go, dude. That's the answer. He found his own answer. But this is, Nathan, you're so funny. Dear barcode Jesus. So this is the kind, we're helping him with his religious coping. That's exactly right, Melanie. We're helping use those discernment skills that he had at some point in his life. And now he's facing death. He's dying. And I don't know the details of his family. I just know that he's this guy dying who has this belief that bad people go to hell. So now he's not being punished for these sins. He's forgiven. All the sins are forgiven. So now we get into a deeper theological question, which we're not going to get into in the meeting with the client, is how does that theology work? Can you go around and commit all the sins in the world, but as long as you love Jesus, you're forgiven? In that case, why not just go around committing all the sins in the world? Well, the answer to that is because we're innately good people and we have an internal moral compass that keeps us from doing this. So I'll give you another example, another theology. And again, if you've been in my workshops before, you've heard this story, and I apologize for repeating it. Another guy, same situation in the hospital. This was in a rural community. This was a man who came from a farming community, very conservative, Republican, Christian environment. He was dying. He said to me, he called me in and he said, I have a question for you. Where do you think Muslims and Buddhists go when they die? And of course, as a chaplain, it's not my job to tell him what I think. So of course, I did the reflective thing. And I said, well, it's really not about me. I'm interested to know why you would ask me this question and what you think, right? Get an A+ in chaplaincy for that answer. And he said, well, I think they go to hell because they worship false gods. Okay. And why are you concerned about this? Well, because I just found out that I'm dying and I was a sinner. You know, I didn't really go to church or do any of the things I was supposed to do. And now I'm afraid I'm going to go to hell. And I don't want to be in hell with Muslims and Buddhists. That was his concern. Because his culture has taught him that those are bad people or different people, and he doesn't want to be in the same afterlife with them. With that, I really didn't have a brilliant answer, but and you know, part of me wanted to just sit down and say, first of all, they don't worship false gods, and you know, let me tell you about Buddhism. No, I'm not going to do that. I frankly can't even remember how I resolved that situation, but I think I asked my supervisor to assign another chaplain to him because I was not able to meet him where he was. And that's what we do. We meet them where they are. Wherever your theology is, whether I agree with it or like it or not, I have to join you in your theology and help you grapple with it there. I'm not there to change it. I could not do that with that guy. So yes, he was afraid. And the real situation, and I know that I did do this with him, is let's talk about your afterlife. Let's talk about what you're expecting and what you're expecting death to be like, you know, and that's where you go because he's only really talking about himself. Okay, so let's see what else here. So this also, you know, brings us to questions about suffering. And you guys, I'm not watching the time, so help me out here because I could go on and on and on forever and ever and ever. This God in the sky theology, and this is really, I'm repeating what Brian said, is that we are born flawed. And our purpose within this theology is to improve ourselves to the point where when we die, we can go to this good afterlife. And how do we improve ourselves? Well, sometimes we can do that by doing good works, being charitable. That's, you know, there's salvation by works, or we can do it salvation by faith. So, for example, the biker guy, his theology said salvation by faith. Doesn't matter what you do. You can do all the bad stuff. The works don't matter. It's just the faith. And another view, kind of like Craig was talking about, is the person who's giving and caring and serving all the time. And who knows where their faith is. Maybe that's just salvation by works. So it's all about this theology of suffering. It's the whole reason we have religion in my opinion, is because people have tried to make meaning of loss. It all starts with loss. So go back, 200,000 years ago, and the first primitive human creatures are on Earth, and they're wondering about what are those twinkly things in the sky, so they make up mythologies. Like the ancient Greeks had this beautiful story, or no, it was the Romans, about up above the sky, that was Mount Olympus where the gods lived. And it's always bright light up there. And when the gods get angry and have fights with each other, they argue and they stab their spears into the ground angrily, and it pokes a hole in their floor, and the light comes through that hole to us on Earth, and that's what the stars are. They're just like little shredded holes from the gods. So we're always trying to make up stuff like this. And so much of it comes from loss. Like you're in this primitive tribe now, and a leopard comes into your camp and eats your baby. Or, there's a massive volcano eruption or a tsunami or any of this, and everything's wiped out, or anything, your husband dies, your mother dies, any loss of any kind, your village is taken over and conquered by another village. And you have to make up a story about it. And because it's the human thing to make meaning, and that nothing wrong with that. But the thing that baffles me all the time about theology is how did we as humans create a meaning and a theology that is rooted in the idea that we are innately flawed? Why did we come up with that one? And why did we come up with a God who is essentially a warrior God, who favors one tribe over all the others, who commits genocide on all the other tribes so that his favorite tribe can rule? We made that story up. And while we humans, or the ancient Israelites, were making up that story, there were groups of people all over the world making up thousands of other stories. For some reason, this story went platinum, and the others didn't. Anybody want to guess why? Well, good, Brian. Yeah, the Roman Empire for sure. But I was going to say missionaries, evangelizing, and basically Paul and his whole idea. And it was really in Matthew too, that now that we have this idea, now we're talking Christianity, of course. I was starting out with Judaism, but it morphed into this thing where we have to spread this all over the world and tell people that they have to have this thing or they're not in the in crowd. And this is what we were talking about earlier as well. If you don't convert to this, you're going to burn in hell. Here's all these horrible stories and these horrible, narratives and imagery, and that'll scare anybody into it. And as somebody said in the chat earlier, not only were missionaries going around and preaching this punishment if you don't convert, but they were also giving you goodies if you do. We're going to come into your tribe. We're going to build a clean water system for your people. We're going to build some houses. We're going to build a school for your kids. We're going to teach you how to read. We're going to give you food. All you have to do is read this Bible. And, think about what happened to the Native Americans here, where the kids were taken away from their tribes and put into Christian schools and having their language taken away from them. And this sort of spins me off into all the different kinds of grief that is touched by this, because not only do we have loss when somebody dies, or a relationship ends, every one of those kind of losses has a satellite of other losses around it. And if let's say you get divorced, and what usually happens for women, especially women with children, is your financial status drops into the toilet and you're poor and you're raising kids. So you've lost your financial stability. Maybe you've lost friends. You had to move to another community. Maybe you were very religious and didn't believe in divorce. And now here you are divorced. So you have shame and doubt in the religious doctrines, all these other kinds of losses that happen. There's cultural and social loss. And so if we look at people, I teach a class called Spiritual Care for Marginalized Communities. And we always have to remember that If we're talking to somebody who comes from a legacy of colonization and slavery and displacement, they're carrying that grief in them as well. So every Native American or Native Hawaiian or Black person or Jewish person that you've talked to has a history of oppression that's also being carried in their cellular legacy of grief. And this all ties into these theologies of separatism, which is, I know I'm going off on a tangent a little bit here, but these are the basic qualities of what makes a cult. And I'm going to end with a couple of little points here. Actually, I have it over here, so forgive me for looking over to the side here on my other monitor, but that's where it is. I'm going to end by just kind of giving you a wrap up of toxic theology and religious trauma and the kind of ways it's instilled in us as children if you are raised in a very strict religious environment. So you basically have an authoritarian power hierarchy that demands obedience. So that could be your church and your pastor and your leadership, but it's also God, that hierarchy, and the church, you know, perhaps the Pope and the Vatican. There's policies of separatism. These are our people, those are everybody else. We're saved, they're not. You can't play with the kids outside of our community. You can't be friends with the Jewish kids down the street. A threat-based reality, fear of punishment, catastrophic end times. You know, in a lot of toxic theology, natural disasters are blamed on sin and God being unhappy. Pat Robertson blamed the Haiti earthquake on gay people. So there's that. Psychological mind control techniques that encourage isolation. Brian talked briefly about rapture anxiety. If you believe in the rapture, which is a particular Christian belief, children come home from school and their parents aren't in the house, they're in the garage or something, and they think that their parents have been taken up in the rapture and they've been left behind. It's a long list of stuff here. Followers are held to a rigid, static system of beliefs. Questioning and exploration is discouraged. Outsiders are viewed with suspicion and disdain. Biblical texts are interpreted literally. A belief that God rewards piety and faithfulness. I could go on and on and on. But I think I can take a couple of questions before we stop. Hold on just a minute, let me check the time here. Oh yeah, I got 10 minutes. Okay, I like Melanie's question. I'd be interested in exploring where this goes with the more explicitly spiritual but not religious. I'm afraid of death, but I do not have a theological framework for it other than the one I reject. Really good point. You know, I don't know if any of you read the book from the 1970s called The Teachings of Don Juan by Carlos Castaneda. He was Don Juan was a shaman who taught Carlos, who was an anthropologist, these different ways of understanding life. And one of the things that always stood out for me all these years was he said, the only way to know how to be on the right path is to get off the wrong one. So if you leave behind a toxic theology that you were raised with, a belief that you're going to go to hell because you're gay, and you know in your heart that that's not true, do you need to find another theology to replace it? No, you really don't. What's going to happen when you reject the theology that you rejected is you're going to be in a spiritually spacious state. You're going to be in that stage 4 where you're flexing and you're learning and you're open and things are flowing in and things are flowing out. And that is a magnificent and beautiful process. You don't have to have an answer. All you have to know is that you're not going to go to hell. Maybe you don't believe in an afterlife at all. Maybe your consciousness is going to just sputter out and that will be the end of it. But if somebody is questioning that, there are so many tools and so many resources to find other ways of looking at it. All you have to do is there's seminars, there's online podcasts. Thankfully, in this time of life, we have the internet. We have the miracle of the internet where we can teach ourselves anything that we want to learn. And so someone who's exploring the fear of death, what does that mean? That's a wonderful topic to explore. You can join a death cafe, or fear of death support groups. All of this stuff is out there. You're not alone, and you're not isolated without help for this sort of thing. And if you're in hospice care, if you're in a hospital, or if you're in the care of a therapist, all you have to do is ask, how do I deal with my fear of death? And hopefully the professionals will say, here's a really good book you can read. Here's a group that you can join, and the resources are absolutely out there. And exploring the afraid of death concept is huge, because there's a difference between being afraid of dying and being afraid of being dead. Think about that. That's the first question I would ask. Are you afraid of being dead, or are you afraid of the dying process? And if it's the dying process you're afraid of, the hospice nurse can make that much easier for you. You won't have pain. You will be cared for in hospice if that's the kind, if you have an anticipated death. If you're afraid of being dead, what will happen to me when I am dead, that becomes a theological question, doesn't it? And so that's when you want to start exploring those embedded theological beliefs. What kind of afterlife were you taught to believe in? And let's look at some other cultures and some other views. And once you start looking at the multicultural thing, it opens up the world tremendously. There's a wonderful book by Gregory Shushan, Shushan. Actually, he's going to be a speaker at a conference. I told you earlier that this is sponsored by a conference I'm producing called the Conference on Death, Grief, and Belief. And Gregory is going to be one of our speakers. He's an awesome researcher who studies near-death experiences across cultures and throughout history. And his research compiles all these accounts back to very ancient times of people who have died and come back. I don't know if they were resuscitated or they just came back on their own, and they report these experiences in other dimensions. This has been going on since the beginning of time. And what he has found is that they are culturally subjective. So it's very unlikely that you're going to find a Christian going to an afterlife where they're dancing around with Shiva in the pantheon of Hindu gods. It's very unlikely that you're going to find a Hindu going to heaven with streets of gold and St. Peter and Jesus on a throne. So what the research shows about these different cultural scenarios is that we bring our cultural expectations with us across the threshold into the immediate experience of death. We only know about the immediate experience of death in these reports because people are brought back. They come right back. They're resuscitated. We don't know what happens after that, right? We only know what happens in those 2 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes where somebody was clinically dead before they were brought back. So we only know what happens right inside the doorway. And I guess do I have 5 more minutes, Brian? I'm not really paying attention to the time. I think I do.
Yeah, 5 more minutes, Terri.
All right, I got 5 more minutes. Good. Okay, let's see what else we can ask. Linda asks, describe the difference between spirituality and religion. That's a tiny little question. Funny, because I was on a podcast yesterday where I was asked the exact same question. And so here is my answer. Religion is generally contained in a box of structures. We have a history, we have a story, we have behavior codes, we have characters in the story that are part of the story, our heroes, our gods, our patriarchs. So religion has a whole story built around it, and we're supposed to follow that story. And when you get even deeper into religion, not only does it have the story and the history and the structures and the characters, kind of like writing a script, it also has the catechism. It also has the doctrines. Here are the things we are supposed to believe. You absolutely are supposed to believe that Jesus was born on a virgin and rose on the third day. Or you absolutely have to believe that there's heaven and hell, or that women can't talk in church, or whatever the thing is. So that's religion. It's a very well-built structure. Spirituality has no structure. Now, within spirituality, you can find yourself in a system that has a structure. And this is where we kind of start looking at New Age theology as also being toxic, because here's the spiritual world. It's wide open. You can believe anything you want. You can explore. It doesn't tell you who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. It doesn't have a history of our people conquered their people, and therefore we're the ruling people. It doesn't have any of that. It's spiritual. It's mystical. It's not human. It's not in the third dimensional human realm of thinking. It's way up there on, level 6 of Fowler's stages. So spirituality is open-ended like that. However, you can take your spirituality into a tight little cult-like structure very easily. Another speaker at our conference in July is a woman who was in a New Age cult for many years. And they had really strict dietary rules that had nothing to do with health. They had this idea that you should only eat certain color foods on certain days. And the colors were connected to numerology. And so on Tuesdays, you could only eat red food like tomatoes. And on Thursday, you can only eat white food like rice. And I don't know, something like that. And when she was in this cult, she had a car accident. And the leader of the group told her it was because she ate the wrong food on the wrong day. So she's going to be at the conference. You'll get to hear her story. That's pretty interesting. So that's my explanation of the difference between spirituality and religion. And you got to be careful, because you can attach. And so like Brian was talking about the law of attraction. So we go into the law of attraction, which is exactly the same as the Christian theology of if you do the right things, God will reward you. It basically says if you think the right things, if you think positive thoughts and dismiss negative thoughts, you will manifest wealth and love and health. And I cannot tell you how many people have come up to me and said, I did all the things I was supposed to. I wrote affirmations. I made a vision board. I meditated and I envisioned perfect health. I envisioned my organs all pink and healthy inside, or whatever the thing is. And I still have cancer, and I'm still poor, and I'm still alone. What did I do wrong? And that question, what did I do wrong, is the same one that I hear from Christians who say, I did everything I was supposed to do to please God, and my child still died of cancer despite how hard I prayed, and I had my whole prayer group. What did I do wrong? And that's where the toxic theology is in the what did I do wrong question that comes at the end. And that's what I feel that the spiritual but not religious community is trying to get away from, and replace it with something that does not have that question at the end. Doesn't have any answer at the end. There is no end. It's just an endless spiral. It's the universe itself. All right. On that note, we are out of time. I'm going to have to take off my speaker hat and put on my moderator hat. So Brian and Angela, are you ready for me to close this window? Angela says yes. You're good, Brian? All right, guys, you're going to have to log out and log right back in again in a minute, and I will see you then. Thank you.